Hi, Miss Carlson. I hope you're well and doing all right in this quarantine. Growing out the beard, but I don't know. See how that turns out. Anyway, so to get started on this, I thought, obviously, the most obvious and prevalent antithesis opens this soliloquy when, his famous words, "To be or not to be, that is the question." And, it's a pretty stark contrast, obviously, between, life and death. And it really seems that Hamlet's in a state where he feels completely powerless either way. Up until this point, it's just been a complete, I don't even know how to describe it, decay, if you will, of his mental state, which as a result, which was a result of, just terrible fate. And we'll go into that a little later when I talk about betrayal and all that. But so I thought, that first antithesis kind of set the groundwork for the rest of the soliloquy in terms of really that contrast between life and death. And almost, he really starts out in a black and white sense, saying to be or not to be, life or death. But I feel like throughout the soliloquy, he kind of almost, in a way, kind of equated them in the way that there wasn't a right answer per se. And so I feel like throughout the soliloquy, he kind of arrived to how life and death, really are similar, at least in his situation, how terrible his life has been up until that point. So then some of the metaphors that I thought were most important in the soliloquy, he says, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end, the heartache, and the 1,000 natural shocks, the flesh is heir to. So obviously he equates sleep to dying. And then the other metaphor that was important was he talks about the undiscovered country, which I interpreted that as the afterlife, as being an unknown to any human. And I really think he does these things because, or these two metaphors, he's trying to make the incomprehensible comprehensible to the human mind, right? He's, these big questions that have, humans have never been able to answer, like what is death and what's the meaning of life? And I think he's trying to equate these things to things that are very real to our lives, like sleep and country. So I think he's trying to make sense of such big and broad topics that no one can really understand, and then so one of the questions was, how did he get to this point, such a low mental state? And I thought, I think that the driver of that decay was obviously the betrayal of those who he held close to him. Starting with his father's death, of course, his mother's betrayal of him, his uncle's murder of his father, and finally Ophelia betraying him. It seemed like everyone that he held close to him ended up turning on him. And, especially Ophelia, I thought that was really interesting because she seemed like someone that Hamlet could find relief in at a time when everything was kind of falling apart with his family, especially his mom. But then when she turned on him, it kind of left him with nobody. And, that's tough, especially when, you have a love interest and it doesn't work out, especially when she betrays you like that. It's tough. And I really think that, that has kind of driven him to that point of considering suicide. And then he looks upon death as an unknown and in kind of an ungodly act, and therefore he would rather trudge through this weary life, as it says in Schoology. It's interesting, he kind of brings God into it in terms of how suicide is a sin, and I think that kind of pushes him over the edge in terms of choosing life. But again, it really seems like he's almost equating his life, which is so terrible, to death, in the sense that he feels so powerless in his life because everything that's been done to him has been out of his control so far. All the betrayals and that. And then this kind of reinforces what I said earlier. I said Hamlet's whole mental state has decayed throughout the play to this point. Hamlet seems to reach rock bottom in his soliloquy. So, that really I do think is a direct result of the betrayal that he's had to face, so far. I mean, I personally cannot imagine, the family is supposed to be, the rock that you kind of build your life upon, and without that, it would be incredibly hard to keep going. And, it's clear that Hamlet's kind of losing that motivation to keep life going. And then themes up until this point, I kind of mentioned earlier, the importance of family. I think the loss of Hamlet's family and obviously the pretty catastrophic effects that's had on him has, in turn showed how important family really is. And I think Shakespeare's really trying to emphasize that, and the power and the stability that family gives to somebody's life. And then, of course, the other side of that is the power of betrayal and how damaging it can be. And there's a couple layers to that. There's family betrayal with his uncle, his mom, and then, of course, his betrayal with Ophelia. I mean, that's kind of a different sense of betrayal in terms of, it's kind of a love interest, but, either way, they both have very devastating effects on Hamlet. And then finally here, I'm going to read this. My acting skills aren't fantastic, but we'll give it a shot. All right, so. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say, we end, the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks, that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation, devoutly to the wished, to die, to sleep, merchants to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life, for who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office and the spurs that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. Who would fardels bear, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country for those whose born no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have, than fly to others that we know not of? Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment, with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action. Soft you now, the fair Ophelia, nymph in thy orisons, be all my sins remembered. Alrighty, I try to emphasize the metaphor of sleep and death, and obviously the which one was it? The country metaphor into the unknown of death. So, and then of course a little flair at the end with the exclamation points. But anyway, so I hope you enjoyed that, and stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.